All right, guys, the truth about money. This is a good one. So I don't know how much of history I'm going to go into here, but I'm going to have to touch on a little bit to get into it. I may end up having to do a part 2 on this because, this is a big subject. But the reality is, what is money? Most people don't understand what money is. And a lot of people don't understand how certain things work, the financial system, the banking system, fractional reserve banking. Most people don't understand these things. I've spent years and years researching this. And without getting into, some crazy conspiracy stuff, I'll just say that, initially, back in, I think, Egypt, or, back in very early civilization, humans traded grains and salt and other things as money. And it was a means of exchange, right? So everyone, you should have a basic understanding of economics and understand that money exists because, it's a unbiased, diversified means of exchanging for various goods. So if I have a bunch of cattle and you have a bunch of corn, and you already have some cattle, and I want some corn, you're not interested in giving me some corn for cattle because you already have some. This is the problem that money solves. It solves a very inherent and basic need, in which is the ability to neutralize the exchange differential between, commodities and assets and resources. So, but the truth is, throughout history, money's been used, and money's been kind of, it has an interesting evolution, right? So there's a very interesting evolution behind it. The earliest form of money was used back in, I don't know exactly when, I didn't just come off of my research, I'm just jumping into this. So it was back in, BC times, right? So a couple thousand years ago, there was gold. Gold was a primary source of value. Precious metals were used as exchange, right? They were initially pounded out into coins and used throughout different civilizations. So gold was being used as a means of exchanging for goods and services. And of course, he who had the gold makes the rules, right? That's the golden rule from back in the day, right? He who has the gold makes the rules. Now, we're no longer on the gold standard, but think back to when gold was used to mint coins, and who had all the gold? Well, the kings had all the gold because they ruled and they taxed and they had, all the resources, right? So it was distributed in that hierarchical system. So that's how it began. And if you really go into the history of it, where banking was introduced was this idea of the money changers. The money changers, in Italy, the reason that Jews are oftentimes portrayed as like greedy or with money or good with money or accounting types is because they were banned in Italy. During the Renaissance, they were banned, and they had pretty much the only job they could do was to be money changers, was to count money, and they were basically accountants, right? And don't quote me on the exact accuracies of everything I'm saying, but this is a rough translation of my memory and recollection of different research I've done. So, but essentially, what happened was eventually, banks came to be when people stopped wanting to lug around bags full of gold, right? And they wanted somewhere safe to keep it. And so the first bank started by offering a safe place to deposit your gold, and they gave you a little slip, and that slip was representative of what your money was used for. So it's like, or how much money you had in the vault, right? So I had 1,000 gold coins in the vault. I had this little slip. Now I could take it, and then it was like a ledger, right? So you could go to the market and buy some grain, and you mark it off your ledger, and then it's basically an IOU, or you get a little slip that represented a certain amount of your gold, and you gave it to someone in exchange for goods, services, resources, whatever. And what happened was the banks started realizing that people weren't coming back to pick up their gold, so they could start lending out more than they had, in which case they were making, this is how fiat currency was created. And so, in the beginning, this was how banks became, the idea of fractional reserve banking still today comes from this idea. Now, if you look at the way the banking system is set up, there's a lot of people that will say, there's central banks and that the Federal Reserve is owned by, a small group of shareholders. And the Federal Reserve does have shareholders. We don't really know who they are. But that's a different discussion. And if you think about it, it's supposed to be a private institution represented by our government, which is us, which is but there's a lot of speculation that says that if you go back to the history in the American Revolution in England and look at how the American Revolution happened, that there's some ties there, and if there's some ties with the City of London and possibly the Vatican, there's some really interesting things about how our system of government and finance has been intertwined and basically established and set up over hundreds and hundreds of years. But those are fun facts that I'll have you look into for yourself on your own time, because the point here is that we want to talk about money. What is money? Well, today, if we look at our system today, without going too back, we're going to flash forward now and go in today. What is our money today? If I pulled out a $20 bill, a $20 bill is simply a representation of debt. Because it's backed by debt and is backed by the confidence of everyone who uses it. That's what makes a currency usable, is that everyone agrees it's worth something. But if you look at what that dollar actually represents, it's really only backed by debt, and this is where it gets kind of really mind-blowing. So if I was the first bank in history and I issued $100, right, and you came to me and you wanted that $100, and I said, I'll give you this $100. This is the only $100 in existence. No other money exists. This is the only $100. This is the first $100 ever to be minted, ever to exist. I'm going to give it to you. Okay, so I've just given you $100. Now, our agreement is you're going to pay me 10% interest. So you have the only $100 in existence, but you have to pay $110 back to me, right? Where does that money come from? Where does that interest come from? Okay, so it doesn't exist. It never has existed. And so the only way for you to get that 10% income is to go get some other money from somewhere else. Well, in order to get some extra money from somewhere else, someone has to go to the bank and they have to get their $100, right? Now, there's 20% interest owed to the bank. So there's $20 owed to the bank that doesn't exist because there's $220 in existence in the world of the bank, but there's only $200 in physical currency that exists. And so you might do some work for this guy and he'll pay you $10 of his $100. Now he has $90 and you have $110, and you go back to the bank and pay the bank, but there's still that extra $20 in interest that doesn't exist. And now this guy is in debt $20. Well, where does that $20 come from? Again, he has to go rob Peter to pay Paul. In other words, that interest only continues to grow. The amount of money that doesn't exist continues to grow. And where does it come from? Well, it doesn't come from anywhere. That's the banking system. It doesn't come from anywhere. You're screwed. So, now for you, if you got that extra $10 by working for it and paid back the bank, that's good for you, but somebody else has to go in debt. So this guy went in debt, an extra $10 in order for you to have paid off that bank. But basically, all the bank did was transfer that liability over to this guy. The bank never had any liability to begin with. So this is really fundamental to understand. So how does fractional reserve banking work? What is the banking system? When you go to a bank, most people think that they're signing for a loan and the bank is just shoving depositor cash at them, or paying off their loan with depositor money, and that's simply not the case. So where does the bank get the money when you sign for a loan? Well, your credit basically allows the bank to extend a loan out of thin air. Your credit gives the bank the ability, based on how much capital they have in reserves, to issue money out of thin air. Okay, so what that means is when you go to a bank and you get a loan, say you need to get a $100,000 mortgage, all that bank needs to have, for current regulations, current laws, the bank simply needs to have $10,000 in cash on hand. Okay, if they've got that cash on hand, they can push a couple numbers in their machine, in their system. They can punch the numbers into their system, and they can issue that $100,000 in debt out of thin air. Now, that debt becomes their asset. Again, did they lend you $100,000 in cash? No, they didn't. They lent you $100,000. They created $100,000 out of thin air. And what do they require? They require you to give them the 10% down. So you're giving them the 10%. So they literally have a license to print money. It's really more a license to print debt. So when they have this ability to print debt and they're licensed to print debt, and you come to them because your existence in the system is to be someone who is enslaved by debt. That's your point in this financial game. You're a pawn in the system, right? So pretty much everyone, unless you're a bank, is a pawn in the financial system, and your role as that pawn is to go into debt. So for the banks, your job is to be a debtor. That's all you are, that's all you'll ever be, and that's your destiny. And so really, and if you look at it, and this is the 99% versus the 1%, and this is the mechanics of the game. Now what is the purpose of being here and being in this course and listening to this program is to understand how to get onto the side of the 1%. Well, the best way to do that is start a bank. You have to have a couple $100,000. You have to get a bank charter. You have to follow your laws and regulations, get a good attorney, do all that. It's a lot of work. But my point is, understand the banking system and how fractional reserve banking works, and the fact that, the bank is not lending you money. The bank never lends you money that they have. They issue, whenever you get a loan, any lender, car loan, auto loan, credit card, bank loan, HELOC, whatever type of capital you're getting from a bank, they're not pulling cash out of their vault. They are never pulling that cash out of their vault. Never. They're not. They're issuing debt. They're issuing debt. And whenever you sign for a loan, you sign as a debtor, as an agreement for the debt, an agreement that you'll pay back the debt. You're essentially agreeing to paying for money that doesn't exist. You're agreeing to pay for something that doesn't exist. And, the implications of that are basically, you have to come up with the interest. So not only you have to come up with the money to pay for the debt on something that doesn't exist, but you have to come up with extra money to pay for the interest in order for the bank to make a profit. So this is the fundamental truth about money that most people don't understand. Now, with that information, what do you do? How are you empowered? Well, now you're empowered to understand how the financial system works. Okay, and once you have that understanding, there's a lot. You start to look at things in a different way, and you start to understand, how things work, and this is really important. So what is the truth about money? That's the truth. It's not real. It's a figment of your imagination. In fact, it's really only backed by debt. And, the reason that the government has to keep raising the debt ceiling is because without raising the debt ceiling, there would be no cash. There has to be debt in order for cash to exist in the economy. That's economics. So understanding banking and economics is really the key to understanding how money works. And then, if you have these fundamental understandings, then you can see that, when you go to actually purchase an asset or something like that, there's certain banks that'll negotiate. There's certain ways to get into properties and do transactions that this understanding will help you to have. So another key facet of this is the fact that we're no longer on the gold standard. I mean, what that means is that back in the day, our dollars were backed by gold and silver, which means that you could redeem the slips of currency for gold or silver. So it was a true currency. It was truly backed by something, and then there was this meeting on Jekyll Island between J.P. Morgan and the Warburgs and some of the banking elites back in the 1900s, prior to the Great Depression, prior to the stock market crash, which they pretty much bragged about creating, which is another thing. If you understand that, the markets are basically relative to assets and to basically decisions that financial institutions make, then you can position yourself to be in a certain, to take advantage of those events. Obviously a lot of people were hurt by the Great Depression, and so it's really not a laughing matter, but to them it kind of was. And this is how certain banks and certain institutions have remained in power and control for such a long period of time. And so why this is important is because you have to understand that it's a game. You have to understand that it's not real. It's monopoly. Okay, and then you also have to understand that the level of wealth that the banks and the 1%, the true 1% have, is far greater than you actually can comprehend, because you've never actually seen that kind of money. You've never really gone. Even if you're a millionaire, it's it's a drop in the bucket. Okay, and to the billionaires, you're getting a little, you're starting to get into that realm. But if you look at the true assets and true, holdings of some of these companies and people who have been in that realm for centuries, we can't really say, we don't really know the breadth and scope of their wealth, because it's truly beyond fathomable. But that being said, this is going to give you an understanding of how money works and the mechanics of the financial system, and that's going to empower you on your journey. So I hope this was useful to you, and I'll see you on the next one.